you very much for your very informative talk. I have a comment and a question. Okay, the first comment, it's in relation to the Anglo-Saxon model. The famous Enlightenment French philosopher Rousseau famously declared, "The people of England think they are free. They are gravely mistaken. They are free only during the election of members of their parliament." Yes, exactly. Now, in Ireland recently, a government-appointed citizens' assembly, and this is in relation to climate change, composed of a nationally representative group of people selected at random, heard detailed testimony on climate change from a range of experts. No lobbyists or politicians were allowed in the room. The result, a strong recommendation enhancing climate change action was overwhelmingly endorsed, including citizens being personally prepared to pay more tax on high carbon activities. And the general view expressed at this particular citizens' assembly was, we have an economy where we steal the future, sell it in the present, and call it GDP, which is interesting in terms of citizens' democracy. Now, your opinion on that. And in addition, Gerald Hafner, on behalf of Democracy International, argues that citizens' initiatives and referenda should be bound to international law as well as constitutional principles, and has expressed the view that there is no supreme constitutional court in Switzerland that could stop citizens' initiatives breaching Swiss law. And Switzerland lacks a preventative judicial control determining whether initiatives are compatible with the constitution and with international law. And Hafner's concern is pointing for example, in Hungary recently, the right-wing government of Orban recently used a form of direct democracy to have the people, there was a low turnout, vote in favour of closing the borders in relation to refugees. So is that an issue in terms of Switzerland? And what about the flow of information? Like how do people in a direct democracy inform themselves? Like in Australia, we have shock jocks, a concentrated Murdoch media, and we also have the machinations of a Cambridge Analytica. So how do we ensure that people are informed so that they can actively participate in citizens' forums and act officially in a citizens' democracy?
Maybe there's a lot there, but I would just like to comment on the last question, if I might, and then I hand over to Arthur because I think he's more familiar with that. But in terms of, you're absolutely right, in terms of the Swiss democracy, there are occasions where the people, because they are very, very conservative, where the people vote for something that is not in accordance with international law. And one of those things was they were going to expel foreign people with a criminal record and make them stateless. Now, under the United Nations, that's not allowed. So what they did is they adjusted it and they made sure that it would still conform, albeit untidily and certainly not democratically, but that's what the way people vote. So, there is no such thing as a perfect system. There are systems that are better than others, and I would argue that on most things the Swiss democracy is better on it than ours, but on some it is lacking. Another instance was where the Swiss people or a canton voted that people with incurable sexual drives, can't be cured, that they should be locked up forever. Now that's against human law, so they had to then, that was the government's job, they had to then adjust it so that they weren't theoretically locked up for life, but they found it very, very difficult to get out of prison. But they had to make adjustments. But, I think you're right, there are instances where even direct democracy, giving people a perfect vote, will not work.
Just to comment on that last point, the Parliament has to has the right to recommend whether someone votes for something or not, and I don't know if they can actually change the wording. Normally the parliaments change the wording or suggest wording changes to legislation, and I don't know if they can do that if it comes from the people. But they kind of formulate things, in the sense the parliament doesn't do nothing, it actually formulates the motions, if you want to call it that, that the people vote for in their referenda. So they've been workshopped quite thoroughly, and that presumably would pick up this sort of problem. The other 2 points you asked was about the Irish having random people selected. I didn't suggest that as a method of government. I actually quite like it. This was alluded to where they simply choose 100 people at random and then say, you're in charge of the country for a year. If you don't know something, find someone who does and work out policies, and you'll all get your same salary and you'll get your jobs back at the end of the period. So in other words, you've got the choice of stuffing up the country or doing as good a job as you possibly can, and those people find the resources and do the best they can, which is better than a whole bunch of people climbing up some party ladder to meet some other agenda. But of course, it's a very radical suggestion that you chose people at random, so I didn't explore it. But I personally think it's actually quite good, because I have an optimistic view of, if you put people in a situation like that, they will do the best they can for the long term and for the community. As far as the GDP question is concerned, should it measure things, my plan for that was to flick past it. What? Hang on. You want to say something about GDP, the relevance of GDP?
No. Look, if you look, go back to the slides, right? All the slides in blue had nothing to do with GDP, right? They were employment, they were debt, all that sort of thing. I actually think that GDP is the greatest crime that the economists have ever put on the human race. And you can prove anything with GDP. The Economist, which has been publishing for the last 60 years, would hardly ever have an article that doesn't mention GDP. Here is what it wrote in April of this year. It said, GDP is not only very bad to measure the economy, it is absolutely bloody hopeless to forecast it. You know, I mean, everybody knows the shortcomings, you know, and that's why what economists, smart ones now, what they do is they don't put all their eggs in one basket. They don't use GDP. They use GDP very advisedly and very cautiously, and they look at what they call a dashboard of economic indicators, which is employment, a whole range of things. The problem is we don't have the information. You can only express those things that have been measured over the last 70 years, and that's what I've used in my book, you know. But you're absolutely right, GDP is no good.
Next question, please.
Yeah, g'day, Brian Concannon. I just have 2 quick questions. First one, I'd like to know your views on Iceland, moving away from Switzerland, next door almost. During the global financial crisis, they jailed the bankers, and less than 10 years later, the economy's booming. They rejected austerity, and yeah, it's booming. I'd just like to know your views on that, and as well, the TPP. You're talking about how. Yeah, just the other question, sorry.
I can say something about Iceland if you want.
You want to talk about Iceland?
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about Iceland.
I would be the first to admit I'm not an expert on Iceland. I do know that their finance, their banking system was lending and borrowing 20 times as much as their GDP. And I think, you know, they're just off the planet. They're just off the planet.
So I can tell you something about Iceland because I went there to cover the 2016 elections, which happened just before the American ones. So the situation on the ground is that the price of real estate did not come back down again. And in fact, people are able to afford property in Reykjavik, for example, in particular, through turning the whole city virtually into Airbnb. And they have 1 million people coming there as tourists every year, and they are upholding the economy. There's only just over about 330,000 actual inhabitants, but it is the price of Airbnb that is actually permitting people still to buy property in Iceland. That's a big problem, that the prices of there was a big housing boom in prices, and then they didn't come back down, and it's Airbnb that's actually keeping the place afloat.
Okay. Yeah, the other one was about referendums in the TPP. Corporations have been given more power than the government. Like, they can sue government if they lose profits now. So that's put governments in more powerful than the government. Corporations are more powerful. Do you think the people deserved a referendum on that? Like, something that makes corporations more powerful than government? Like, shouldn't the people have had a say?
Yes.
I'd like to ask a question to both of you. What are the differences in principles and in practice between direct democracy and anarchy in terms of rule of law and human rights? There's examples, there's here arguments. I can say in a direct democracy, there is a social consensus between all citizens that following majority decisions is mandatory, even for those people who vote against them. And it's the duty of the whole society to enforce with will of the majority on the minority. And in an anarchy, however, taking part in a community institution is voluntary. People don't have to follow any rules they don't agree with. The other argument is the anarchy system seems difficult to maintain, but it's no more difficult to maintain than any other forms of society. The difference is that individuals have more control over their own lives on the anarchist society than in a democratic, direct democracies. The perception here is that understanding that maintenance of the direct democracy comes in the form of systematic violence against people, in the form of enforcers, so that may not have violated the rights of others. Thank you.
I'm probably not as good on my definitions of political systems as I ought to be. My understanding is that anarchy is ruled by the people, with the individuals doing what they like. And any political system has frameworks and laws that people fit into. So the question is, are you looking at what happens in practice, or are you looking at semantic definitions? I think a political system wants as much individual freedom as it can have, with as much control by the people affected as is possible. And I think that the Swiss system does allow that, although it has been criticised, both tonight and I think Reimer admits it, and others have said that it can be extraordinarily conservative and even racist. Australia, if you look at the refugees, could be argued to be racist, and certainly both parties believe that keeping the refugees out is popular. Switzerland may be the same. So the assumption that it's all radical if you have control by the people is certainly not true. Women didn't get the vote in Switzerland until 1971, which is quite extraordinary, really. And there was a women's group against voting for women, which is, again, quite extraordinary. So it's not I don't think it's a radical system. Anarchy has the implication of radicalism, which isn't in the political science textbooks. So I don't know. I guess as to whether it's anarchic or whether it isn't, I think is a matter for someone who knows the definitions better than I do. In practice, it works quite well, which I suppose is where I'd sit.
All right, so thank you, gentlemen. Interesting discussion this evening, which I would characterise part of as being direct democracy is good, and that one of the reasons that the economic performance of Switzerland, low debt, low unemployment, high incomes, is because of their direct democracy processes. Let me throw a contrary case to you. Let us consider the case of California, which also has citizen-initiated referenda, which has led to a profusion of incompatible laws. High debt, a basically ungovernable budget. The case of people bringing forward citizen-initiated laws to cut funding to schools because they happen to live in areas that have got relatively low school-age populations. Let me also come to you with some media that Mike Baird had in the media recently about how the rise of social media has just made the business of politics that much harder than it has been in the past. It has, in fact, enabled minority voices to be much more powerful than they've been in the past. So let me suggest to you that actually the path to reducing the power of vocal minorities and lobbies is not increasing direct democracy, but is actually to reduce the number of members of parliament and to increase the size of electorates, such that the power of social media and the power of small groups is actually reduced. What do you think?
I put it to Ted Mack, that can you really trust the people? And he said, well, would they have sold off Telstra? Would we have gone into the Iraq War? And the answer is no, we wouldn't have. The people have quite good common sense. And I think if you look at some of the silly referenda, which you cite in California, the basic, do you want lower tax, yes or no, what a no-brainer, then you do get these one-off things. If, however, if you're saying, look, I want to kick the government in the guts, I'm going to vote for Brexit, I'm going to vote for Trump, I'm going to kick them in the guts, or I'm going to vote for low taxes and let the government worry about how they fund things, because, I want to kick them in the guts. You've got, in a sense, a protest mentality. If you say, look, you are the government, every quarter you're going to have to decide what you want, and every quarter you're going to have to sort out the problems that are here. So take a view of what you want for your kids in the next 20 or 50 years. I put it to you that you get stability because the common person has common sense if you ask them to take responsibility. If you give them a one-off chance to kick someone in the nuts when they haven't had much opportunity to do so, you'll get that reaction.
Can I just make one little comment on why would the people get it right when the experts don't? And there's a concrete example where the Swiss in 2003 introduced a bill, and no, not a bill, they changed their constitution, and it was changed on the basis of an initiative taken by people. And the change they made was that we will have no deficit funding and we will have no more debt planned by any level of government, local, canton and federal, no debt. Right, now, the reason the people voted for that is because, as Arthur says, if people vote for something, they will stay away from extremism. They will not go to extremism. And debt is one of those. Now, let me contrast that, what happens in the US. 2002, a year before the Swiss voted not to have debt, George Bush got up in Florida and he said the following: just because you don't have a good job and you don't have a good income, it doesn't mean to say that you can't have as good a house as anybody else. Now, you put your head around that one, okay? Now, and how did he achieve it? Not by giving them a better job, not by doing anything other than going to his banking fraternity and to fund the purchase of houses for the low-income earners on debt. And that debt was the prime mortgage, right? And that was packaged by the banks with George's knowledge, and it was flogged around the world, and every banker in the world now knows what a derivative is and what subprime loans are, right? Now, those dreams were formulated by the chief commander of the US and his chief banker. His chief banker at the time went before the Senate inquiry and committee, and here is what he said. Over the years, we have found that the market is the best judge of how much debt we should have, not whether you can afford it. He says, because what the derivatives do is they allow people, the ones that can afford to take on debt, we can transfer it to them from the people who can't afford it. In other words, debt is transferable, which of course is a load of bull, right? Because if the guy who's got the mortgage can't pay it back, then somebody's in trouble. And in that case, it was Lehman and it was a few other banks, right? And they shafted that all over the world. Now, here is an extreme case where you get a balanced, low-risk approach by the popular vote, and you get extremism imposed on the government by the president and his chief banker, Alan Greenspan. That's it.
Stand in the man one comment. Is that okay? It's not going to take more than 2 minutes.
We'll make an exception.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting how I can see personal law about debt and how popular vote can actually push extremism away. And I think a lot of the conversation has been centered around the Swiss voting system, and in fact, I lived in Switzerland for some time. And whilst I was there, that was maybe about 3 years ago, they actually just voted to have, as you say, 2 things. One, foreigners were removed because they don't actually want foreigners there. Second thing, they voted to have.
Yeah, come up to the microphone, and you have to be very quick now.
You're pushing in, so be quick.
Okay, well, I mean, I just challenge the view that, in fact, direct democracy is in fact a really good thing, because when I was living there were 2 fundamental extremist behaviours that confronted me. And I was living there, and generally you don't really see a lot of foreigners. And in fact, that perhaps, most of the time I was the only Asian. So I just challenge the view that, in fact, that actually pushes extremism away. In fact, I actually think that it doesn't. So that's my view, and that's my personal experience.
Thank you. We'll take. Shall we take that as a comment so we can move on?
Take it as a comment. I'm going to back it up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's okay.
Would you like to say something though?
Yeah. Probably. Yeah.
Well,
Now,
economists know.
we'll keep it very short. But the thing, of course, is I lived there, and I wasn't. The Swiss are very conservative, and that's not to say that direct democracy is going to get rid of racism. It doesn't.
Democracy really only works if everyone comes up to vote, but unfortunately most systems don't actually enforce it because there's so many referendums going on.
Okay, well, the comment is that direct democracy doesn't work because unless it's, if it's voluntary, not mandatory to vote, a lot of people don't vote, and because of that, it gives you a skewed answer. It may do, I don't know. But I think, any foreigner is discriminated against by the Swiss because they are very conservative, and they, if you're not Swiss, then you have to prove yourself.
I'm bothered by the idea that debt is bad, I guess. I mean, if anybody's going to owe money, have money, someone else has to owe money. That's the way our money system works, right? So, we haven't had real money since like sometime in the 1930s or something. All our money is fiat currency now. So if anybody is going to own government bonds, then governments have to have debt. If anybody is ever going to, if the government is going to pay its invoices 60 days after they come due, that's a debt, right? Having government debt is actually quite important, and the world won't function terribly well without it.
Yes, no, yeah. Look, there is nothing wrong with having debt, providing you can service the debt and you can pay it back. The problem is if you can't. And the countries that we've put up here today, the US can't. They've run deficits on external accounts and deficits on the fiscal budget, okay? The same with the US, with the UK, the same with Japan. Japan has an external surplus, but it has a 9%, it's running 9% of its annual budget short every year, and its debt is going through the roof. Now, if you say debt is good, Paul Krugman, who's a leftist economist, I read him every day because I think he's good value, but he's wrong on that, and he's wrong on a few other things. And there isn't one country in the world that has high debt. Name me one country that has high debt and that is successful. They can't. It doesn't work. And the issue is...
What's Australia's debt?
Sorry?
What's Australia's debt? Is Australia's debt high?
Which we are working...
You listed Australia as number 8, as though Australia was high debt.
No.
Australia's had uninterrupted economic growth for the last 25, 30 years.
Yes, and why are we...
considered high debt and successful.
Why, and wigh... No, but we are also growing debt at a faster rate than any other country.
But there's your counter example. You said no country has high debt and is successful. We're standing at one.
No. We are not. We have debt at 60%. I said anybody that gets up to 100% is in trouble. And that's true. And we won't get there because people won't let it happen, but we are irresponsibly spending too much money on importing luxury cars.
Jefferson.
Yeah, well, I've lived in Switzerland too, and the reason why I'm speaking up is to wake up the guy who's got to get the last train to Khartoum because he's falling asleep listening to these economists here and these failed political scientists. Now, all right, you turned me down. Very good. I'm probably the only person in the room who walked round the tour of Rousseau's museum in Vevey on Lake Léman or Lake Genève with a French woman doing the explanation of what Rousseau believed in for an hour in his house in Vevey and went, where, all the way through it, and without understanding a single word she said because my schoolboy French was not up there. But anyway, leaving all that aside, I'm probably the only person in the room who's skipped out on a $20 Swiss franc Swiss cake shop when they weren't taking my money. Now, getting back to the thing, it's not only bloody Swiss cakes and Swiss bank accounts, it's the hole in the Swiss cheese that Kim Il-Arthur, whose father was born in North Korea, Kim Il-Arthur should keep in mind. Now, my question to Kim Il-Arthur...
Is there a question?
Yes. My question is, what's the difference between your partner's description of anarchy as the ideal political system and what Lenin said in 1917 that the workers' councils would rule with the direct democracy and would guide the central committee? I mean, Marxism versus the Swiss model. And when I was in Switzerland, When I was in Switzerland, all the gardeners were from Spain and Portugal, all the nurses were from Sweden and Denmark, and you met the Swiss there. The Swiss, no one ever meets any Swiss. It's a four-tiered system. It's corrupt, it's bloody buggery. The Swiss just count their money on their bank accounts. Direct democracy. Even if you busk in Geneva, the cops come and arrest you. For fuck's sake, there's no democracy in Switzerland.
Thank you.
And you got to hitchhike. You got to hitchhike from Nyon to Geneva because the train fares are like $100 to go 20 kilometres. Yeah, highest living standard in the world. The Swiss can't afford to fucking live there.
I'll promise to be slightly more...
What I'm trying to talk about here is that there are alternatives to the Australian binary political system. And I'd said that if you have people voting in referenda like they did for the marriage equality, we could have a different political system here. I'm not saying at any stage that Switzerland is the ideal country or that there's no racism in Switzerland. Really, the nature of Switzerland is not important. I was picking an alternative and saying that the Australian and the Anglo constitutions are not good. And Reimer was here to say, look, there's other ways as well. I'm merely saying this is one way and contrasting it to the faults in our system. I'm not saying we have to go like Switzerland. I'm saying we have to evolve a new political system. So, I mean, I'm sorry about the ideological stuff and what Lenin said in 1917. I'm sorry, I really have no idea. But I'm sure... Well, okay, perhaps he said that. I don't really see that's relevant to what we're going to do with democracy in Australia now.
All right, I promise to be slightly more coherent than that. All right, I mean, there's so many things that I think that were missed in your in the analysis that's going on here. Namely, wondering, a question like, okay, why can't the direct democracy work here? Well, let you use the gay marriage referendum as a success for the Australian people being able to sort of make good, valued decisions. But if you look at the voting population of that, 18s to 45 actually were the lowest people participating in that. And mind you, as a millennial, that is probably the number one issue that people my age cared about. People didn't care about tax. They don't care about health. I mean, they care about these things to such a benign extent that they won't actually do something about it. And that this was an issue that they forced themselves to vote on. And they were still the smallest voting population in the referendum. Everybody at 45 and up were in the 80s in terms of participation for that referendum. And you see the terrible effects that happened with Brexit, where you have buses with Nigel Farage in them saying, we're going to have £350 million reinvested into the national health system, and there's a lot of misinformation that makes these things happen. I know that you're a doctor, and so you value science. If we had like a referendum in something regarding climate change or something like that, the amount of misinformation that can happen to something like that. I mean, there are already nutters who believe stupid things about climate change, and it's already such a finite issue and you're an economist as well. I actually study economics as a minor. It's one of the things that I think people are the most illiterate about in the world, and this is why you get people talking about, this is why you get armchair economists online spouting some of the biggest nonsense. My point is that people are very illiterate on certain things. They don't have the education in certain issues regarding whether it be science or the economy. So that's one point regarding the nature of how these things work. The other thing is that the historical conditions and the material conditions of Europe compared to a country like Australia, Europe is very vastly, for the most part of it, outside of Britain, they're monolithic cultures. They've been able to, they've sustained this way. I know racism has been brought up, but that's pretty much a really big, that's a really good example, because we're looking at now the immigrant crisis in Europe. And these countries are falling apart. You're seeing the rise of fascism in my country, Italy. You're getting two Eurosceptic parties that are basically at a stalemate there. You had in Paris, you had Marie Le Pen being able to get into the presidential race. In the Netherlands, you had Geert Wilders. I mean, and in Germany, which is seen as the more rational agent, you're seeing the rise of the far right there. And so we're seeing, as soon as these monocultures are being challenged, that they're starting to tumble in this kind of chaos. So that's more of a comment that I think that these ideas that direct democracy sometimes works is sort of failed on two fronts. One, because the cultures are vastly different. We have to look at why that's working there, and we have to look not just so much at the models, but at the historical conditions of these places. And we also have to wonder about the cultural differences in terms of like what an Australian teenager, an Australian millennial is like compared to a French millennial and stuff like that. Because these are very vastly different things that you have to consider.
Look, there's no perfect system. And I mean, you can say that the public are ignorant. Well, that may be, but God help me, look at the cabinet we've got. I mean, what are we comparing it to? We're not comparing it to some perfection, We're comparing it to what happens now.
The cabinet's not ignorant, though. The cabinet's being deceptive on purpose, though. I mean, if you were able to have an idealistic situation where you had like doctors, for instance, like a cabinet of doctors working on policy reforms for the best medical legislation in a country, that would be beneficial. Leaving up to legislation, should we have a carbon tax, and then having the coal industry saying, coal's great, the tobacco thing. You having to fight the tobacco industry in that particular way. If we had people, sorry.
As I say, there's no perfect system. I'm saying the common sense of the common people is better than the board efforts of hierarchical politicians. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I can't comment on everything in every party in Europe or the ins and outs of the prejudices in Switzerland.
This is another question for Arthur. In your long fight to control tobacco use, we've just recently had a national plebiscite on same-sex marriages, which was very unprecedented, really, in Australian electoral history. Could you imagine a form of words about controlling tobacco? And if you had some time to think about it, and you got a movement going, could you use it? Could you have a national plebiscite similar to same-sex marriage to be put, which were sent by the ABS to every household, and to do with the control of tobacco and its taxingness or whatever? Apparently not.
We used to dream of the fact that someone would have a plebiscite on, do you want smoke-free indoor air?
Yes.
Do you want tobacco advertising? If we'd had a plebiscite on that, we'd have blown away in 5 minutes, at least 25 years before we could get the government off its thumbs. So in a sense, again, the common sense of people would have made it easy.
Mm.
But it didn't happen.
Mm. Can you think of something now? At the moment, there's a particular type of lettering on the bottom of a packet of cigarettes, and people under the age of 16 aren't supposed to buy them. But they're still an addictive thing, like alcohol. There's no warning on alcohol to say that if you drink half a dozen times, you're likely to be habituated to it.
Well, we've got to fight the wars on obesity, vaping, alcohol and so on if we're going to stand and exercise. They're the new frontiers for public health.
Okay.
I think people will accept that something needs to be done, and I think that the people would do it more quickly than the government, which is getting huge amounts of money from those lobbies. So, I mean, these are illustrations of where the changes I'm advocating would, I think, be good.
Okay, thanks.
Arthur, you're very bothered by corporations having influence over political parties. A big reason why corporate donations have such an influence over our political parties is because our political parties run on the smell of an oily rag. I mean, if you add up the election funding for all the parties, it's something like 1/100% of our GDP. Now, we could very easily afford to make that a few 100% of our GDP. We wouldn't really notice the extra buckets out of our pocket. And suddenly the influence of corporate donations be much reduced. Is that a good idea? Why is no one pushing that?
Well, the funding per vote has gone up quite a lot. It's a couple of dollars per vote now, but that still becomes a drop in the bucket. No matter how much public money you put in, the corporates put in such a multiple of that it swamps the public funding. I mean, the Greens and the Democrats have basically tried to run on public funding, and blind Freddie can see that they're horrendously underfunded compared to the Liberals and even to Labor. So you can chase the corporate dollar with taxpayer dollar, but you tend to get just an escalating war. And it's very hard. One of the things I learned from tobacco, it's very hard to stop bad people giving people money. They find a way of doing it.
Make it illegal.
Well, yes, quite.
But what is the ratio between corporate and public? I thought it was about 1.
Oh, God, no. It depends which party you're talking about. You're talking about the Greens, it's probably a half corporate to 1 public funding at most. I would think less than that. In terms of the Liberals, I reckon it'd be 10 to 1. So, I mean, this is what I'm saying about the corporates getting in there. I haven't got the figures off the top of my head.
I'd like you to thank both of our speakers. They've been very patient. And just to remind you, next week, it is the invasion of the Australian Workers' Union. Please come back and for the Workers' Union, bring your loud voices with you. Good night. Thank you.